Good evening. This is Rich Fazzillo, the Executive Director of the New England Hemophilia Association, and we want to welcome you to an educational webinar entitled The Patient's Perspective About Clinical Trials and Emerging Therapies. This webinar is an extension of NEHA's Consumer Medical Symposium that was in March, where we had healthcare providers and patients throughout the day share information about clinical trials and emerging therapies, and in particular, a panel which will be duplicated tonight on this webinar, share their perspectives about clinical trials and the emerging therapies that are coming into the bleeding disorder community. So before we begin, we just want to go through some of the ground rules and reminders of the webinar itself. So tonight's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. We do welcome you to participate and ask questions. All panelists are on mute. If you have a question in your GoToWebinar control panel at the bottom, there is a question feature. Simply type the question in there, and when we are done with the presentation, I will ask the question out loud to the panelists. So again, in your GoToWebinar control panel, in the question tab, you can ask the question in there, and that will be read out loud to the panelists. In tonight's webinar, no medical advice will be shared, and the views expressed are those of the panelists and not of NEHA, and nothing that is presented tonight constitutes or endorses any products or services. So without further ado, we have a esteemed, incredible panel tonight of community members that were at the Consumer Medical Symposium. This picture that is in front of you is of the panel and what they look like, so it gives you a picture in your mind since we're on a computer. So in the first person is Mark Borellis, then we have Kayla Klein, then we have Michael Rudishan, and then we have Laura Gluffling-Tam. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and he will start, and then we'll go down the line and have each person introduce themselves, where they're from, and their involvement with the bleeding disorder community. Mark?
Thanks, Rich. Right, so I'm Mark Borellis, and I live in Southborough, Massachusetts. I have hemophilia A, severe factor VIII deficiency, and then in addition, because it has some relevance to some of my participation in clinical trials, I'm old enough to have been infected both by HIV and hepatitis C. The hepatitis C has been purged, but interestingly, that was through a clinical trial therapy. And I've been involved with the NEHA community off and on I was trying to figure this out, and I think it comes to just about 40 years now, either serving as a volunteer or working with the board, and it's been a great privilege throughout. And I look forward to the next period of more intense activity.
Great. Fantastic, Mark. 40 years is an incredible time and tenure to be involved. So thank you so much for all that you do. Kayla?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla Klein, and I live in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, so right in Boston, with my husband and our 2 young sons. And my older son, Robbie, who's 3, has severe hemophilia A. And we've been involved with, and my father also had hemophilia, so passed away in the 80s due to complications with HIV. I have been involved in the bleeding disorders community since childhood, and interned in college at our local chapter of NHF in Pennsylvania. But we've been involved with NEHA now for about 4 years, so not 40 like Mark, but 4 years since Robbie was born.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kayla. Mike?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Rudershan. I live in Brighton, Massachusetts, so right in Boston as well, just a different section. And I have severe hemophilia A, like Mark. I've been involved with the community since I was a child, first attending some of the early Christmas parties, and then I attended family camp with my family. And then when I was old enough, I started attending as a counselor and did that for a number of years. And I've tried to go to as many spring and fall fests as my schedule allows. Been to a number of different events as well throughout the years. So it's a good community to be a part of, and I'm happy to be here.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. Laura?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Tham, and I'm from Quincy, Massachusetts. I am the mom of my son, Andrew, who's 18 years old, who presents with severe hemophilia A. I have his permission, because he's an adult now, to share some of the information on the webinar this evening. We have a family history. My dad also had severe hemophilia A and contracted HIV and died from AIDS complications in 1993. I was not part of the community when I was younger. My parents were not either part of the community, but we joined NEHA when Andrew was 3 years old, and we've been active participants both at family camp as well as Fall Fest, Spring Fest, Consumer Medical, and other events.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura. As you can see, we have this incredible group of expertise and many years of experience on the panel tonight. As we said, the title is about clinical trials and emergent therapies. We are in a very exciting time for anyone living with a bleeding disorder, whether it's hemophilia, VWD, or other rare blood disorders. And the purpose of the Consumer Medical Symposium was to have a conversation as a community as to what this all means. So for the first question that we're going to ask our panelists is, have you and or your family ever participated in a clinical trial? Why or why not? What was that like, and how did you decide? So Mark, I'm going to have you kick this off first.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Yes, I have participated in several clinical trials, and probably most recently on an extended half-life factor product, but then reaching further back, some very simple trials that were essentially just data collection, where you'd fill out a written survey, and that was pretty much it. That was very simple. And then the ones that required, that were a little more emotionally intense, were those, of course, that related to emerging HIV therapies, as well as hepatitis C. So I participated in several trials back in the 90s, the early 2000s, of new drugs that were coming down the pipeline. There were actually quite a few that really appeared in the 2000s, and like a lot of the therapies that are emerging today for bleeding disorders, they represented certain advances. They were constantly improving upon the prior therapies, but what was different, perhaps, about them was that when it came to deciding whether to participate, that those were very dire circumstances back then, and that was sort of a foregone conclusion. It was as if one had cancer, and suddenly a promising cancer treatment became available on an experimental basis. There was really not much reflection required. Nonetheless, I would, there were things to consider as far as the side effects of the therapies, but it wasn't, I won't say it was no choice, but in weighing the alternatives. There was every reason to attempt some of these clinical trials. By and large, my experience with clinical trials has been very positive in that ordinarily I've just found that while there are, these are the people with whom one interacts, the clinical trial coordinators, the actual doctors that might be the principal investigators of the trial, like Dr. Croto, they're very compassionate and they're very grateful for the fact that you're willing to do this, and they're very supportive. I was always impressed in particular by how careful they were to make sure that you understood what you were getting into. It's a long process, as you may know it's a long process going through the consenting process, giving informed consent. They really made sure you were informed. Yes, I've tended to feel like clinical trials, I felt very good about them. They've ordinarily held out a needed opportunity for me. And more specifically, in the case of the emerging long-lasting factors, I was very interested and motivated to get on a trial for those because it seemed to me that could represent a major improvement in my own management of my hemophilia. So yeah, it's been a pretty straightforward decision-making process for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Kayla?
Hey there. So yes, my family and I have participated in a clinical trial. Like Mark, we have been on, I think we still are, on a few, data collection studies that we have signed up for over the years. But one in particular that was pretty life-changing for our family was a trial that we signed Robbie up for at birth. And thinking back to it was kind of brave on our part in the sense that we were new parents. We knew Robbie was going to have hemophilia at 19 weeks through a amniocentesis, so we were prepared in that sense. It wasn't we did not find out at birth, so we knew beforehand. And so that helped us kind of plan for the clinical trial in a sense as well. We were sought out to participate, and after thinking about it for a while, having a newborn and not sleeping, we kind of just, it's a lot to have a new baby, but we decided to go for it, and we think it's one of the, one of the best experiences that we've had, or decisions that we've had in, Robbie's short life, and I think that it has helped us to not only understand hemophilia better, but understand the ins and outs, as Mark has mentioned, just in the hospital itself and who does what, and the PIs and the coordinators and the pharmacists and the CAT-CR and the CTSU and all the different acronyms. And so that really is empowering as not only a new mom, but also a mom of a child with a bleeding disorder. And Joel and I decided, pretty straightforward. We had another neutral third party look over the, I'm blanking on the actual name of the, look over the trial for us. And that person recommended, hey, I think this is good. So we decided to go for it and never looked back.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, Kayla. Mike?
Hi. Yeah. So I've been involved in some of the data collection trials as well through the HTC. However, I've never been involved in a clinical trial that's evaluating a new drug. And so I'm a little bit different here than some of the other panelists. For me, a lot of that really just stems from my fear and anxiety over the unknown of the new medication. For me, the way I view it, and this is hard for me, the way I view it is that, with my current medication, I have everything under control. I have a good regimen plan. And for me, I am comfortable sticking with that. For the interim, I understand some of these newer medications look promising, and I continue to follow the data. But for me, I don't feel comfortable sort of being in that trial, just given the fear and anxiety that I have around that. I think that makes that process uncomfortable for me. The reason why I have a hard time with this is because I work in the pharma industry. I'm a medicinal chemist. I absolutely understand the importance of clinical trials in obtaining data. And so I absolutely struggle with both wanting to do it and then having that fear, that almost crippling fear that doesn't quite allow me to sort of take the leap. So for me, what I try to do is continue to educate myself on the upcoming medication, and as things progress, just have conversations with my doctors to learn more about when might be the right time for me. But that's kind of how I approach it. It's hard for me to sort of decide to be in a trial, sort of given the fear and anxiety that it causes me.
It's an important perspective, and thank you so much for sharing, Laura.
Hi, yes. So Andrew was a very active participant in his HTC meetings, comprehensive meetings. And around age 16, he had a conversation with his hematologist where he really was very interested in long-acting factor and wanting to infuse less. So after doing some kinetics and finding out that he was actually a very good candidate, he has an excellent half-life, they determined that he was a good candidate for that, and he decided with the hematologist and certainly input from my husband and I to switch to a long-acting factor, and he was actually enrolled in the ATHEN-2 study, which is ATHEN stands for the American Thrombosis and Hemostasis Network, and they do a study tracking factor switching to see if individuals have a change in bleed rate and whether or not they develop an inhibitor. So he was in that study for 1 year from the time that he first received the dosing through 1 year, and he basically had to just log on a computer, and which tracked it on a website, and they tracked how often he infused, the dosing of the infusion, and whether or not he had a bleed and whatnot. So the ATHEN-2 is the only clinical trial that he's participated in, and it was quite easy to participate in. He just had to log it on the computer and wasn't complicated at all. And I think it actually gave good information to the hematologist, and certainly helped to see whether or not people are developing inhibitors and whatnot on this product.
Thank you so much, Laura. We have a couple questions before we go to before we go on to question 2. And before we do that, I just want to read the definition of a clinical trial. A clinical trial are research studies that explore whether a medical strategy, treatment, or device is safe and effective for humans. These studies also may show which medical approaches work best for certain illnesses or groups of people. The question that came in is, what benefits to the community do you see clinical trials given in the overall care of patients? And this is open to anyone that would like to jump in here, and I'll read it again. What are the benefits to our community that you see clinical trials playing in the overall care of patients? Any of the panelists can jump in if they have a thought on that.
This is Laura. So I think that it really benefits the community to sort of gather information to see whether or not a product is effective, to see if inhibitor rates are going up. We know that that can be a huge problem in terms of management of hemophilia. So Andrew was he really wanted to participate in this data collection. From a personal perspective with my dad, I know this is not necessarily the topic, but that the tracking and whatnot of factor product and keeping those logs really was very informative. When my dad was diagnosed, to find out which batches had the HIV in it. And so I'm quite passionate about this kind of data collection and tracking over time. So Andrew sort of followed my lead, and he also was very interested in participating again in the Athens 2 study.
Yeah, Laura, I think that's a good point. I'd just add to that. I mean, the only way we can get new medication approved that can benefit our community is to go through these clinical trials. I mean, that's the first readout on any potential medication in humans. And so, I mean, these are incredibly important for our community. I mean, we've seen it with the longer lasting factors. We're seeing it with some of the newer upcoming medications that are just newly approved or will be getting approved shortly. I mean, it's the stage gate, sort of the last step to get these compounds or these drugs approved and for use in the wider community. So it's extremely important that community members participate so that we can all benefit.
Fantastic.
Rich, do you mind just repeating the question one more time so I know that I'm answering it in a non-rambling
Yeah.
way?
Yeah, no, absolutely. What are the benefits to our community do you see clinical trials given in the overall care of patients? So what are the benefits of clinical trials to patients in the bleeding disorder community?
Yeah, so exactly what Mike and Laura said. For us, it was looking at immunogenicity and efficacy, and those are two big things, especially in our community, that are important for the quality of life of our children and for people with bleeding disorders. So that was something that was basically those two kind of points that our trial looked at, and that's absolutely important for our community as a whole. So we were happy to be able to continue on that data and help provide that data for them. And also it's fascinating too, because if we don't do the research, then how can we? The research itself is fascinating, but if we don't do like Mike was saying, if we don't do the research, then how can we benefit the community?
Another question came in that kind of piggybacks on this, that looks at, and I'm going to summarize here, but there's risks and benefits when you look at things like clinical trials, and we need them to advance treatment in our community to see what works and what doesn't work. How do you decide for a child, a teenager, or as an adult, if this is right for you, knowing that there's risks associated with something like a clinical trial?
Wow, yeah, this is Mark. Let me take a shot at that. I think that there's no one way, and that the decision-making process is by definition a very, very personal one, because everybody's circumstances differ, and whether they're in a position to take a chance, that is to take risk, because every trial really does involve some element of risk and benefit. It's going to be different for everyone. So, for example, what Mike has said about why he hasn't, why he's pretty much refrained from any drug interventions, that makes perfect sense to me. There really are potential risks there with any new factor product, so far as inhibitor development, or at least it's thought there might be, and that's a pretty good reason to step back and think about it. I also think it's really interesting what people have just been talking about in terms of, well, this is a necessary thing to prove. It's a proof of concept sort of proposition. If there aren't patients who are willing to do this, then some of these therapies might never really achieve the testing that's required in order to present valid results to the FDA for their approval. And so to some extent, there's a little bit of that altruism question that's presented by new therapies, certainly, especially in the early phases of testing, like a phase 1 trial that's just testing safety, and you're really stepping out there on the unknown. I really respect people and admire the fact that people are willing to do that. When I think about gene therapies, for example, that's risky stuff. It can be. Gene therapies 20 or 30 years ago, some of them produced very dire consequences. So there's a whole lot to consider, and I just think sort of anywhere you come out on that is fair, because it's going to be reflective of your own ability to take that chance.
Can I add on to what Mark just said, and Mike actually too? So I think as a parent, I was very nervous about switching, but I think my responsibility is to help my son be a good problem solver and to ask the right questions and to try to evaluate his condition and what his wants and needs are, and whether or not he was a good candidate or not. And when the hematologist said he was, and he was looking to do fewer infusions, we also waited until the product had been out for some time. So we did not participate in an early clinical trial of this particular product. We waited until the product had been on the market for some time before making that decision. So I think that was important as well. The studies looked okay, that there really was not inhibitor development, and that people were doing well on this particular product. And so he decided that he wanted to participate, and he switched product, and he's done really well. And it was a no-brainer to, as I said, to do the sort of data collection part, because there was no harm, no foul. It really just gave additional data on switching factor products. So I think we'll continue. My advice to my son would be to continue to monitor things, and if things look like they're heading not in a good direction, that would also come through in the clinical trial. And then he can make another informed decision about whether or not to stay on or not stay on. So I think it's a moving target, in my opinion, that you don't always have to stay on the same product. And that I agree with Mark and Mike that it's a very personal decision, and it's not right for everyone. And everyone makes that decision for him or herself and should not be pressured to make a decision that they're not comfortable with.
I think for us, looking back on it, what someone said to me once, like, wow, you guys were really rogue. Like, what rogue? That's crazy. Like, putting a kid on, your child, a newborn on a study, and looking back on it, it was definitely because the product that we were on was not yet FDA approved. So there wasn't, all that data on it on the market yet and things like that. So we really went into this with the full faith and trust in our physicians and our hematologist and our pediatrician who read the trial for us and gave us a perspective on it, and we kind of just went all in. And looking back on it, it definitely was a little daunting, but and again, it's not for everyone. And but if we were to do it again, and we had this opportunity to do it again, we definitely would consider it and go for it if everything was aligned. But it's absolutely a personal preference, and if you have the time and you get to think about things like proximity. For us, we had to go in often for visits, and so we had that proximity to the hospital was imperative for us. We needed to make sure that we were able to be available when we needed to be.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, a lot of times you're going to hear about these trials probably through your physician. And, I think the best thing you can do is just, have that conversation with your physician, be informed, don't be afraid to ask lots of questions, even, make a pros and cons list, get out your yellow legal pad and jot down, what you think would be beneficial, what you're maybe afraid of, and
That's
ask
exactly what
lots of
we did.
questions. Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of how I work through things myself. Even though I usually end up on the this scares me side, I can see the benefits. I can work through that. I can have that conversation with my physician. And you know what? Maybe one of these is I can see a clear benefit, and I'll go for it. But I think that's really important, regardless of where you fall. Have that conversation with your doctor. Ask lots of questions. And that will help you no matter which side you fall on, the yes or the no. You will feel comfortable and confident in that decision. I think that's the most important place you can be.
Each panelist brought up some pretty incredible points right now in terms of really thinking this through, pros and cons, writing things down. And one thing that's really resonating as I'm listening to everyone here is making sure you have a good working relationship and trust with your healthcare provider, to talk to them about this type of information. But really, whether it's deciding for a child or a teenager or for yourself, it is proximity to a hospital. It is, many different other variables in terms of the time and what it could mean for your family. So lots of things to juggle with this. Before we move on to question 2, we have a couple of other questions about clinical trials. And Mike, this is directed at you to see if you can answer it. What is the percentage of clinical trials of products that come to market after the study ends? If there's a rough estimate of the percentage of clinical trials that actually are a success. Not sure if you know that answer or not.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. Off the top of my head, I don't have a number. I'm trying to think back. I can picture a graph in my head from a paper I've read, and I can't remember the number, but I know success rates are low overall. And it can be for a number of reasons. Everything you do preclinically is done in some sort of preclinical animal model where you're trying to get an understanding of how well whatever your drug is will affect the disease. And while it may look really promising in your preclinical models, obviously you have to test it in humans. And that's sometimes where you see the disconnect. And because of that, because there are some unknowns as you transfer from some animal model into humans, things can start to fail. And so there are a lot of variables and a lot of places where things can fail. There might be an unforeseen toxicity you didn't expect. It might just not be efficacious at all, and not have the effect you wanted, or there's just a myriad number of reasons. And I wish I had a percentage, but I do know for the number of targets that are looked at preclinically, and then even when you get into the clinic, things tend to fall out, and so the successes are even more impressive, to be honest. I'll see if I can dig up some actual percentages, or maybe someone else on the call knows. I just don't remember offhand, but I should be able to dig that up. In fact, I'll see if I can do a quick Google search here and see if I can get that for you.
Yeah, we actually, Mike, you're spot on. We actually had another panelist that just said it's about 14%.
14.
So
yeah, I was thinking it was around 20.
Yeah.
So that's pretty good. Okay, good.
Yeah, and I think again, this is perspectives and not truly specific scientific data here, but I think that, question directed at you with your profession, and, just goes to show that a lot goes into making sure that from the time there's an idea to the time that the FDA approves this stuff, whether it's in the bleeding disorder community or not, that there's a lot of monitoring and there's a lot of thought. And just as you said, Mike, not everything goes through from A to Z, and it is being looked at with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that safety is the number one priority. But speaking of that, let's, in the interest of time, let's go on to question 2, and we can go back to some of these other questions that are still in the queue here. But if you have a question in your GoToWebinar control panel, please feel free to ask the question there, and we will do our best to ask the panelists. So transitioning from the clinical trials to the new therapies. In the past couple of years, we have seen longer lasting clotting factors be introduced. We saw a new treatment late last year be introduced for inhibitor patients. And there's a lot of talk within our community, from the Consumer Medical Symposium and at many other, about where does treatment go from here. So the question here for our panelists, and let's start reverse this time and switch it up. And Laura, we're going to start with you instead of Mark, and we'll work backwards from here. How do you and your family decide if a new therapy is right for you? Please kind of explain the process of deciding, not so much the clinical trial, but when you see a new treatment that's FDA approved, what's the process that you kind of go through in terms of deciding, is this something you will even bring up to your healthcare provider?
Hi. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I think Andrew was about 16. He decided to participate in kinetics. And so that's a 2-day process where you assess someone's half-life to see how he's responding to factor and whatnot. And he has a very good half-life. I think it's like 17 hours or something like that. So it was really long. And his hematologist brought up to him that she thought he would be an excellent candidate for long-acting factor. And as I said, he really wanted to try to infuse less. And he was looking towards college at that point, and he had a job and trying to just manage his schedule. And he was just really interested. So we waited, as I said, a bit to sort of see what products were on the market. And we decided to move forward with a specific product, a long-acting factor. He went in around Christmas time, Christmas vacation week, and he got his first infusion. And again, we are very close to the hospital, so it was an easy trip in, as Kayla mentioned. And they did the initial product at the hospital, and then he had to go back in for some additional measures thereafter. And then again, he's continued to stay on that product and done actually quite well on it. As I mentioned earlier, he participated in the Athens 2 study, and so he had to log every infusion. He luckily has not had any bleeding. He's always had good response to factor, and he's never had an inhibitor. So that everything seems to be, he seems to be responding just as well to the new product, if not actually a little bit better. He reports he feels better on this product versus the other one. So, and he self-infuses and he's managing it and doing quite well. So I think so far all seems really good. So the other thing I'll just mention quickly is that, again, my philosophy is, as a teenager, I've tried to hand off prior to him turning age 18, when he had to take full responsibility of his medical care. We've tried to phase it in over time. So he became more and more active in that process. And my husband and I have pulled back. And so I think he hopefully was a little bit more set up to take more responsibility as he got a little bit older. Clearly, we're still part of the conversation. He's not fully independent at 18, but he's quite active and will state his opinion and wants to be very independent. So it worked, again, well for him and our family and all of that. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Let's go to Mike.
Okay, yeah. So I actually I haven't switched factors for like 12 or 13 years. I've been on the same one for a while now, but I can give you a little idea of what was on my mind at that time when I switched. So um, when I switched, I was on a recombinant factor that wasn't necessarily plasma derived, but if I recall, I could be wrong on this. If I recall, there was still a purification process that involved plasma, so it still came into contact with plasma. So when I was thinking about switching, I was switching to one of the first new medications that didn't have any plasma involved with any part of the process. And part of the reason why that intrigued me at the time was because I did have hepatitis C. I have also been cured. But that made me nervous. The potential again for having a plasma cause some other infection made me nervous. And for me, that nerve outweighed the potential other fears of trying a new product. And so I weighed those pros and cons with my physician, and we both agreed that it was the right time to switch. And so that was sort of the process I went through. Obviously, I was an adult at that time. I was in college. So I was making that decision for myself. You know, with that said, I got a lot of help from my physician. I talked about it with my family, and we all agreed it seemed to be a really good idea. I was a little bit nervous about a potential for an inhibitor and switching, but I didn't have any history of that, and thought that was a low risk, and it turned out I didn't develop one. So that was kind of my thought process as I went through it about a dozen years ago. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Mike. Kayla.
Hey there. So how do you and your family decide if a new therapy is right for you? So we spoke, when we spoke to our physician, I remember my husband asking, um, he goes, so is this good factor? And our physician said, yeah, sure. And was confident. And so we were confident in that. I don't know if it's being naive or what, but we were all in. And thinking back to what Mike and Laura both said, though, my mother, who, was 5 months pregnant with me, I'm 32, 32, yeah, 32, 5 months pregnant with me, when they found out my dad was HIV positive, now had a different kind of perspective on that and was a little bit more hesitant and cautious in what our decision was for our child. And she wanted us to make sure that we really did our due diligence in making sure that this new therapy was right for us, and rightly so. So if I had, so for us it worked. That's how we decided, and we definitely had different people weigh in. And my mom, it's funny, I swear I had a nightmare, not a nightmare, but I had a dream that wasn't so good that we had to switch products. And this was just a couple nights ago, and I was thinking about inhibitors and all this kind of stuff. And it's definitely something that weighs on your mind in switching products and new products. But right now we're good, so we're gonna keep on.
Can I interject really quick? Same thing with my mom, Kayla. My mom was not for the switch. Didn't like, just like with Mike, when we went from the recombinant to the albumin-free, she was a wreck. I think just
Right,
the
absolutely.
history was very, very scary, and I definitely hold that with me. She was definitely hesitant. But again, luckily thus far, things have been good,
Right.
and hopefully will continue to be.
And I think it's good though to be mindful of the past, right? Because and every day, but we still have to move forward as well. So it's kind of, how do you balance that? How are you still, keeping that in mind as you move forward?
Right. I don't think you want to be cavalier and say, sure, go ahead. But I
Whatever.
think, right, sure. But then on the other hand, you don't want to be, for me at least, I don't want to have my hands tied and say, well, I'm never going to move forward because that's, you know what I mean? That may not, that might close doors that might be really good for Andrew. So.
Right.
Great perspectives there. Mark.
Well, I think the first thing I have to say is, I don't know if Mike feels this way, but I feel like being in the position of making these decisions for myself, where it's my health that's at issue, it's my tolerance of the inconvenience or actual risks of toxicities and so forth. I feel like, okay, that's my call, and I can call them. When I think about what Kayla and Laura do and have done, where they're really very, very influential, if not the decision maker in therapies for their children, I find that to be a really staggering responsibility. I really don't. I feel that is a harder position to be in by an order of magnitude. I admire and kind of wonder at your ability to do that. As I thought about it, I realized the answer to your question about, how do I make these decisions about trying something new? This is illustrative maybe of my earlier point that, well, it's kind of depended on where I was at the time, circumstantially. And so, again, going back to the HIV clinical trials, I felt helpless. I felt desperate. There were also very high stakes in deciding whether to enroll in a trial, not so much because you worried about the side effects or adverse effects that might follow, but because you were kind of picking horses. You were trying to decide, well, do I do this clinical trial on this drug, or which will disqualify me from another clinical trial on another drug? And what if I make the wrong call on that? And the result was I was very much in the position that that everyone has alluded to of being highly dependent on my doctors, whom I trusted a great deal. But in the end, I realized, that was a decision where if my doctor had said, no, I think there's a particular reason to look at this one, I would simply have gone along with that almost unquestioningly. So that was how I made those decisions in that time and under those forces that were at work. But then when it came to deciding, okay, do I want to try an extended half-life product? I remember feeling that at that point I was having more frequent bleeds just because of the state of deterioration of various of my joints. And, by then I was already in my 50s. And so that was pretty much what drove my thinking. I was very eager to try a half-life product. So as soon as trials became available and convenient enough, so in my case through my HTC, I was I was camping on the doorstep waiting to be first in line. And I feel sort of the same way as I look at some of these small molecule therapies that are coming about now, and then gene therapies. I'm just waiting to be made aware that yes, I do qualify for one of these probably phase 3 trials at this point, and that's because I feel much more now the effects of microbleeds, and they set in pretty quickly, so that my coverage by even my extended half-life product really doesn't cover me. I have vulnerable days still. I suppose I could petition to increase the frequency of my prophylaxis, but as an alternative to that, I do very much look forward to what may come with these new therapies on the horizon. Well, they're not even on the horizon; they're rolling right down the highway. So, but again, look at the freedom I have. I'm just able to consider what are my pains and complaints, and what does this hold out for me potentially? Is it worth it to me? Again, if I think about having to make those decisions for my children, or more likely for my grandchildren, wow, that's quite daunting.
Thank you so much, Mark, and everyone for sharing those really powerful perspectives there. I cannot believe that it's 7:53, 7:54. This is such an incredible conversation that can go on for hours. I'm going to ask the third question before we wrap up the webinar, and I'm going to ask the panelists if you can maybe summarize it, and if you're able to, in a sentence or two, to get your thoughts on this. If it's a little bit more than that, do not worry. I would rather go over than to stifle an answer here. So the third question dovetails of, or kind of is a transition from the second, talking about emergent therapies, is what are some questions you brought up to your healthcare provider about new treatments or potential therapies? Why did you or didn't you switch to these treatments? We've touched upon that, but if I can ask each person to go a little bit deeper into, if it's not broken, let's not fix it. How do you weigh these types of things, especially as more than likely a sub-Q injection may be on the market by the end of the year for hemophilia A? Mark, you've mentioned gene therapy. We could be seeing gene therapy come to fruition in within 5 years or less. So if I can have each person touch upon what are some maybe questions tailored to these emerging therapies that you may or may not bring up, and how do you decide whether or not to switch to these? I'm just going to leave it open to see who would like to start first instead of going up or down the line here.
Yeah, I can go. So to clarify, so Robbie was, since he was a newborn, we obviously didn't start factor treatment when he was a newborn, but we had to enroll him in the study as a pup, so a previously untreated patient. So he was had never received factor therapy before, and so this trial looked specifically at one therapy as a pup study. So that basically answers. So we didn't really switch to a different treatment. We kind of just went with one, and we really sat down. My husband remembers sitting at these little itty bitty tables meant for little kids, and we sat around with our physician and our team, and had asked questions, and decided to go with it. And but then moving forward, once he was on the trial, we had to, if he did need factor treatment, we had to ensure that he received the clinical trial drug and not a different drug, or else that would have compromised us being on the study. So that was something we had to be very vigilant about, especially since we travel so much to see family around the country. So that was definitely a kind of scary part of it. I even remember talking to our physician on a weekend. They were on some type of fundraiser, and we were in North Carolina, and we needed to get factor treatment. So that was, different situations definitely made me wiser and stronger. But yeah, so that's why those were our questions, and that's how we signed Robbie up for the pup study. So we didn't really switch to anything. We just went with one.
This is Laura. So we switched, or Andrew switched to this different factor. I think the questions were more about, again, inhibitor rates and response. He actually was quite good on his previous factor product. He really, again, knock on wood, does not really breakthrough bleeds and whatnot. So I think it was just more about inhibitor risk and wanting to know how many other people, quite frankly, were on this product, and could we speak to anybody about that? We ended up not doing that, but that was a question as well, because there are choices with the long-acting factor. So we did inquire about that. We did inquire about some sort of clinical trial. How would he be monitored? And could we get the results of that, which have been published? And so, and I think it was just deciding how often he would receive factor, and if we thought that things weren't working, would it be okay to go back to the previous factor product? So that was a conversation as well. You don't really want to switch too often, but we did have that conversation with the hematologist as well. And again, things have gone well, so we did proceed.
So this is Mike. So for me, I can give you a little bit of detail on, so I've had conversations with my provider about some of the long-acting factors. And one of my biggest concerns is the fear of inhibitor development, although I understand that is a fairly low risk, and I've never had one. But that's something I feared, and in my mind, the fear of an inhibitor plus, for me, not really knowing how great the benefit might be. I know for factor VIII, sometimes the half-lives aren't as long as for factor IX, and I wasn't sure it would positively impact my life enough. One of the things my provider has suggested, and I think this is a good idea, I just haven't done it yet, is to get a PK study done on my current product just to see where I stand, and then we could get a better idea of what the benefit might look like if I were to switch. So again, using some hard data, that usually helps me as I think about a decision, being able to utilize the data to help me decide. And so that's kind of the conversations I've had thus far with my physician. And then we haven't really talked too much about some of these new medications, but I think some of my most important questions when I inevitably talk about them with my provider will be questions around efficacy and the safety profile, as well as, I think importantly, for me and I think others in the community, how will it impact my quality of life, right? And especially thinking about some of these newer factors, not factors, newer products that aren't factors that may have longer half-lives, and the idea of not having to treat as often sounds amazing. And I just would want to get a better understanding of how all that looks and how that would impact my life.
Can I add one other thing real quick, Rich? I think the other thing was whether or not it was going to be covered by insurance. So we got prior auth. We tried to get prior authorization, and we found that our insurance company would pay for the factor. So that was also a big decision for us.
Yeah, I think that's, this is Mark. I think that's a very important question, especially with some of the new therapies that are out there. The pricing is going to be, may hold some unpleasant surprises, so that's very important. Other questions I think I would just routinely ask. I would routinely open with what Mike was talking about. That's kind of, well, what's known so far? If this is a phase 3 trial, what happened in phases 1 and 2? What kinds of adverse effects were there? Has anyone developed inhibitors as a result? So I'll really want to know that side of things. And then I also want to know, how will the management of my hemophilia change? If this is, what kind of new regimen will it bring with it? And in an emergency bleed situation, how would, what happens then? Do we know exactly how I'm supposed to dose? And do I now have to teach ER physicians about the idiosyncrasies of this new therapy that I'm on? And then another question, I'd suggest people consider is, what will enrolling in this clinical trial disqualify me from trying? So I think I would be pressing my doctors to tell me, look, are there, in your estimation, are there other products out there? Maybe not being, maybe this treatment center is not a participating site for that particular product's trials. But, are there other products out there that you think might be better bets? And if that's so, maybe I don't want to commit myself to this particular one. Anyway, and otherwise I just endorse the phenomenal collective wisdom of everybody else on this call.
Thank you so much, Mark and Laura, Kayla, and Mike. Your perspectives and conversations tonight has been so insightful and really providing all those listening to this webinar that it really comes down to the individual and making sure that you not only weigh the pros and cons, but have that trust with your healthcare provider and that ongoing conversation of what works right for you. We know in many families what may work for a sibling may not work for another. So as new treatments and clinical trials and all of these emerging technologies are evolving, going back to that patient-provider relationship is key and has been brought up quite a bit here. It is just past 8 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for joining this webinar. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to Laura, Mike, Kayla, and Mark for volunteering their time and not only doing it at the Consumer Medical Symposium, but here on this recorded webinar. This webinar will be rendered and processed and placed on NEHA's YouTube channel, and a link will be sent out to everyone registered, including the panelists, and then we will also post it on Facebook, on social media, and in several emails that we will send out to the community. Before we end, we just want to reference that 14% that was found. It is thanks to Pat Mancini for finding this. It was a MIT study that put clinical research success rate at 14%, and this came out on May 2nd, 2018. If you would like to see that link, you can reach out to us. We'll also put it in the comment section of the webinar. So it's from May 2nd, 2018, MIT study puts clinical research success rates at 14%. On the screen is, if you have any questions or concerns, info@newenglandhemophilia.org gets checked all the time. And our website, of course, is newenglandhemophilia.org. Also works now as anyhemophilia.org. That didn't work before, so it's a shortcut that will get you to our website. But thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to all those that are listening. We will be holding additional webinars like this throughout the year, so stay tuned for more information. But until then, we appreciate your time and attentiveness. Have a great night, everyone.
Good
All right,
night.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.